going through these laws, Pam and I kind of have both sides of the coin when it comes to human trafficking. Pam, the investigative side, me, the service provision side. So when we're going through these laws, we're talking about the law that, and things that need to occur for it to be prosecuted under this law. However, just because you're missing some different parts, it doesn't mean that a victim might not receive services from our program or many other programs throughout the country. Yes?
I have a question already.
Yeah, could we save the questions until after?
It's a discrepancy. So you're saying only under the age of 18?
No, it doesn't say that.
Not under the age of 18 for sex trafficking. You don't need to prove force, fraud, coercion for under the age of 18.
Right.
Yes, and we'll get into that in a second. Great clarification. Okay. So those were really long definitions, and you saw a lot of repetitiveness through each one for sex trafficking and for labor trafficking. As we break down that law to make it a little bit more digestible, we want to remember three things. That we have acts, which we'll talk about. We have the means, which is the force, fraud, coercion, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And we have the purpose. Okay, so you need to have all three of these things for a case to be prosecuted under a human trafficking law. So, for our acts, we have these multiple acts that were listed in that first definition slide. When we're talking about recruitment, obviously, I am going to ask, what do you think might be recruitment? Some of you that did raise your hand and knew what trafficking was. Yeah.
I know that one of the #1 places is at the malls right now, so recruitment could be like, they call them pimps, having like one of their nephews or someone they know, actually going to the mall, talking to girls, targeting girls at the mall, getting them to maybe come to a party with them, etc.
Sure.
Recruiting them.
That's a perfect example. What about labor trafficking? What might recruitment look like for labor trafficking?
I got a job for you.
Perfect. I got a job for you. Exactly. That might be, I got a job for you, you're my neighbor, it's right down the street, or it might be, I got a job for you in another country. Why don't you hook up with this friend or set you up with that friend so you can get across the border and then get this job. Okay? What about harboring? Does everyone know what harboring a fugitive means? All right. So it's the same type of concept. It's providing food, shelter, harboring
Drugs?
somebody. Maybe. A case that, as Jean mentioned, when I used to work on the national hotline, we got a variety of different calls. There was a case that we received a call about where there was a family who had a room in the back, and there was a woman living there. Every day, the pimp would come by, pick up the woman, take her to the brothel, well, the trafficker, then bring her back. Then take her to the brothel the next day, and bring her back. So this family, where she was staying, she was eating with them, she was sleeping in their house, but they weren't forcing her to engage in commercial sex. They weren't taking her money, but they were doing the harboring. Okay? In this case, it was gang related, and they were actually being coerced to do that harboring, so they weren't prosecuted. But the concept being is that it doesn't need to be one person that's committing all these acts. It can be multiple individuals, or it could be just one person. So sometimes it's an intricate network, and sometimes it's not. Yeah. So transportation, again, could be transportation across borders, next door, particularly when we're talking about massage parlors, in a lot of massage parlor networks, or in restaurants with labor trafficking. It may be that the victims are being forced to live at the massage parlor or at the restaurant or somewhere on the premises. They may be being forced to live in a different apartment at a different location. And at that time, it might be that somebody is responsible for transporting them from place of work to where they sleep. And whether that's kind of escorting them by walking or driving them or whatever it might be. So we've seen a lot of different cases where, again, the person providing the transportation may be the trafficker, may not be. And provisioning and obtaining, providing. Yeah. Okay? We also need the means, which Pam brought up before. So first, force, fraud, and coercion. We know what force is. I don't think we need to go through examples of what force might look like. Can somebody tell me what fraud might look like?
Well, just tell them they're going to have a really good job or a good career ahead of them.
Sure, tell them they've got a great job coming, and then it turns out not to be that job. And this is when it gets difficult when you're talking about investigation and prosecution. Fraud can be just word of mouth, so a promise that's not kept, or it could be a fraudulent contract, fraudulent work documents, or visas. Again, the more stuff you have written down, the easier it is to prove in court, but that's not usually or often something that you have when you're building those cases, which Pam can talk about more, I'm sure. And then coercion, we see that it says threats. What might be some examples of coercion that you can think of?
I'll kill you.
Sure, threats of physical harm.
Targeting family.
Targeting a family.
Send you back to your country.
Yes, threats of deportation. And threats of deportation, I'm sorry?
Turn your back over to ICE.
Turn you back over to, it's now called HSI, but yes, it used to be called ICE. They changed their name so many times in the past few years, it's hard to keep up. But they, but yes, so threats of deportation, or maybe threats to call the police, which depending on the nature of the situation might be scary. Either because a victim has already had several run-ins with the police who have arrested them on several occasions for soliciting, or maybe they're from another country where law enforcement is less checked than it is here. So there's more corruption or physical violence in that type of situation. But when we look at this, it's threats of serious harm. And we're thinking about trafficking, we're thinking about developing a culture of fear. So traffickers use manipulation, isolation, coercion, promises of a better life, promises of this American dream to manipulate and coerce victims. So when we're thinking about a domestic violence situation, it's a similar relationship to that of trafficking. There may be many threats at the beginning, sometimes they're followed through, sometimes they're not, but you hear those threats enough, it doesn't matter if you see them being followed through anymore. You know that they have been, or they will be, or their brother's cousin knows somebody who can do it, and so it's something that you would take seriously and would be enough to develop that culture of fear for that victim. And it might not be threats of harm. Another call that we got on the hotline, this was a sex trafficking case. The victim was being trafficked by her husband, and he would set up dates for her across the country. And he had many different ways of manipulating her and threatening her and coercing her into this trafficking situation. But one thing he did was he would threaten to put explicit images of her up in their child's school if she told the police or if she tried to leave the situation. So not a threat of physical harm to her, not a threat of physical harm to her child, but you can imagine what that would do to a mother and how that would develop that culture of fear. That's certainly something she wouldn't want her child to experience. Okay? And as Pam and Carol mentioned, for sex trafficking, you do not need proof of force, fraud, and coercion under the federal law if the victim is under the age of 18. Okay. So last, we have our purpose, commercial sex acts, or labor. And this is a question that maybe we'll get, but I'm going to ask it anyway to kind of pat it off at the pass. Now that you know what trafficking is, what's the difference between smuggling and trafficking?
Trafficking involves humans.
Human.
Trafficking is people and smuggling is things.
Well, you can smuggle people, and you can traffic things like drugs or arms,
Yeah.
but that's a good distinction. You already answered. Okay, I'm gonna. Anyone else besides the people who already answered? Yes.
Way back there.
If you're smuggling, they're doing it of their own volition. Trafficking is more of a forced thing. They don't want to do it.
That's part of it?
That's part of it. Some trafficking victims may enter into a situation knowing that they're going to be engaging in commercial sex or knowing that they won't be getting paid minimum wage. But once they feel they can't leave, once they don't have that opportunity, then it's a trafficking situation. So sometimes there is some of that knowing going on. You had a comment?
It's